Every now and then people ask about or comment on the differences between Olympic fencing and historical European martial arts, which, by the way, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance was called fencing as well. And I just stumbled upon an instructional video by Fencer's Edge about how to perform saber cuts. And this seemed interesting for a discussion and to compare those two. Before I start, let me just clarify a few things. First off, since I have never done Olympic fencing myself, I might be missing some things or misinterpreting, and I'm just going by this video, what I'm seeing there, and just commenting on that. And second, I'm not here to criticize Olympic fencing or specific fencers or anything like that. It's a different thing, different context, different tools, etc. Either way, there are some interesting things to take note of here, and this also ties into discussions about efficient cutting mechanics in HEMA and the issue of delivering the most effective possible cut versus the safest, or really attack in general. So let's get to it.
You want to get familiar with what's your maximum scoring distance. Now the maximum scoring distance is the furthest you can be away from your target and still touch. So you should be hitting with no more than the top inch or two of your blade.
This also applies to HEMA. You generally want to use your maximum effective reach so that you can threaten the opponent while staying as far away as possible from the threat that they pose. So with something like this, a side sword, you generally have pretty significant reach. However, in the context of a historical duel, even without any armor, cutting with just the tip of the blade may not cut it, quite literally. This depends a lot on the type of blade, but quite often you have a taper both in profile and in thickness, which is the case here. So this blade gets narrower as you get further up toward the point, and also thinner. So you have quite a bit less mass here than you have further down on the blade. When doing test cutting on tatami mats and even just water bottles, you can very much feel the difference between cutting very close to the tip of the blade and further down. It feels more solid, and it's typically cleaner when you cut with a bit more of the blade. The argument that people generally make in favor of tip cuts is that you have higher tip velocity. Velocity increases kinetic energy at a faster rate than mass does. So far, so good. However, kinetic energy is not the only factor in a sword cut. Momentum is as well, just like with firearms. Momentum is increased by mass and velocity equally. If you think about chopping wood, say you want to split firewood. If you took an extremely light axe and swung it much faster, would you be effective at splitting wood? No, of course you wouldn't. You want the mass of the axe to really drive in. I would generally argue that, to simplify things, kinetic energy is better at damaging soft tissue and momentum is better at damaging hard things, cutting through bone, for example. It's not just about the target's consistency, it's also about the mass. A light target with little inertia can be displaced easily. A slower moving object with higher mass can push it away before it has had time to absorb all of the force. On the other hand, the extra momentum of that more massive object can keep applying force for a longer time to a heavier target with more inertia. There's a good example from when I tested a chakram. One of the throws hit some loose hanging branches that stopped it. They were light enough to be pushed out of the way by the momentum before the edge had a chance to bite in. With enough velocity, the chakram would have cut through it. Another thing to consider is that you can add more mass to the swing by putting more of your body weight behind it. Driving with the legs, stepping into it increases the effective mass. Even a wrist-powered cut can be enhanced by engaging the core and forming a kinetic chain from the larger muscles in your body to the smaller ones in the forearm. The other thing to consider is penetration depth. Even in an unarmored duel, you might still have some reasonably sturdy clothing. So if you only hit, say, with this much of the blade, and clothing takes away a bit more with the bulk, then this is not a lot of penetration. Pretty sure the female audience will agree here. And especially if you're aiming at the torso, this is where we have our body's natural armor. You're not going to penetrate the rib cage with just the tip of the blade with the quickest possible cut. A different target might be more appropriate, like hands. Hands are quite fragile. And of course, some blade types are designed to cut a lot lower, like this Yatan Saber hybrid. You would not cut with the tip on this. You know, the way it's shaped, you want to be closer to the belly of the blade. So this is a more close quarters kind of affair. So you would draw this through the target. That's the idea. You start with a concussive cleave, basically, and as soon as that connects, you keep drawing it through, and this is what, you know, the initial impact can split bone, and then the following slice can penetrate deeply. Now, of course, a quick tip cut is a lot harder to see and defend against in time than a more powerful committed blow. And there are arguments to be made for a death by 1,000 cuts approach, where as long as you keep yourself safe, even just a light cut to the forehead is not going to be good for the opponent. You know, it might draw blood, which might run into the eyes, and then it's harder for them to fight after that. But you have to be safe, of course. If you do this and the opponent you landed, the opponent takes that hit but retaliates at the same time and cuts you, of course, that's a lot worse if you receive a powerful cut while landing a light touch. Now, the good thing about this approach is, in Olympic fencing, not only does it minimize the time it takes, like it's very efficient movement, but it also keeps the weapon or tool, however you want to look at it, in front of you. If I want to deliver the most powerful cut possible, I'll follow through to some extent, because the goal is to reach maximum velocity that you can generate in this swing by the time it impacts. So the further it's drawn back, the more time you have to accelerate it. From here, you do not have a whole lot of time. If you want maximum cutting power, you need to bring this a little further back so you have more time to bring it to full acceleration. More powerful cutting swords and sabers tend to be balanced further up the blade. So that means it becomes a lot more difficult to stop it in a forward position. So with some heavier weapons, you actually tend to keep them moving around. Now this, of course, is, you know, a lot more exposed than just doing this one quick action and keeping it in front of you where you can defend yourself. Because if the opponent times it well, you know, evades this, and as you come around, they cut to your arm, for example, that's a problem. So you can't do the same pattern repeatedly, obviously.
A big mistake that I see a lot of beginners making is that when they make their cuts, they will cock their wrist back like this and chop down on their opponent. It does a few things. Number one, it telegraphs your attack. It lets your opponent know, hey, I'm about to cut. The other thing that it does is when you pull back, you're opening your arm to stop cuts and counterattacks to the arm.
In this position, if I want more power, I need to draw it back and then cut forward so I have more time to accelerate it. It is definitely more efficient and telegraphs less, in fact, doesn't really telegraph at all, if you go directly forward like this. And you see this with Highland broadsword and saber, where there's a forward step involved, which adds a little bit of velocity by, you know, moving your body forward. So you drive it with the legs as well, not just with the arm and finger action.
The proper way to make the head cut is your arm should extend straight forward, and then at the last second you're going to squeeze with your fingers to finish the cut. The proper way to make the flank touch, as your arm is extending, your wrist is rotating, palm down, and then again to complete the touch I'm going to squeeze with my fingers. My arm is not going to pull through like this.
On the spectrum between speed and keeping yourself safe and power, cutting efficiency, this is on the extreme end right here. This is all about the speed. Of course, the low weight of an Olympic fencing saber also helps with that. From what I've seen, it seems to be typically around 400 grams, up to 500. This is about 2.5 times as heavy. When it comes to generating force in the cut, you basically have 4 options. One is just tensing the fingers. Tensing the fingers can be combined with pushing the arm forward the way it's shown in that video. You also have a wrist-powered cut where you rotate like this, which of course has a bit more power. Then you can also rotate from the elbow, which again, more power. And then finally you have this big sweeping shoulder cut. That's by far the most powerful, but it also telegraphs like crazy and takes a long time. So in and of itself, if you just do this, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because that you can see that coming pretty easily. Say your opponent cuts and you let the opponent's blade push yours around, you just dip it down and you come back around for the cut. So this can be very effective because now your opponent is powering your own counter cut.
The pull through belly cut. Once I've made the touch, I'm going to turn the wrist. And now pulling through, this wrist turn is allowing my point to slide through the target area, and then I'm rotating over. Okay? I want to make sure that I'm not pulling through with my whole arm. My arm stays centered on my opponent's target area, and I should finish right here with my guard in the center of my opponent's target area.
From a HEMA perspective, this is a very odd one. Again, Olympic fencing works with different rules, and it's adapted to those and makes perfect sense within that context. In historical dueling, this would be basically a way to nullify your cut. Because if you change the orientation of the edge in the middle of a cut, you throw it off completely. So this action out of itself, this is just a little chop. This doesn't really have much rotation behind it. You know, like if all you're doing is this, you know, it's basically like taking your bread and, you know, pushing straight down on it. Because I'm drawing through, there's going to be a slicing action. It doesn't have to be the strongly pronounced slicing action that you have with some strongly curved sabers, where you're standing a lot closer and you're really drawing and slicing a lot more. Excuse my sloppy form, this is not a type of cut that I've practiced particularly. I should probably show it with a wider blade so it's a little more obvious. So if at the moment of impact you start to flip this over, you're stopping any kind of penetration that you might have had. Like this, you can obtain a shallow cut with, but if as soon as it impacts, you start to rotate it and throw off the edge alignment, you're stopping it. You want, as it cuts through the target, you want this as smooth and even as possible. Any kind of deviation is going to get it stuck. There are various false edge cuts in HEMA, of course. You know, on some Messer blades, a section here on the back is sharpened. So there is, for example, this kind of cut here, where instead of cutting down like this, you're doing it with the false edge. And that opens up some angles that you don't otherwise have. Let's say this is my opponent's head that I'm aiming for, and of course my opponent doesn't want that. So they're parrying over here. So I can't get any closer than this. But if instead, in the middle of it, I turn it around, I might be able to sneak around the guard or over top. Now I am changing the edge alignment here, but essentially what I'm doing is I turn a diagonal cut into a vertical chop. This is another case where you sacrifice cutting power for a tactical advantage. You know, if the fight ending cut to the head isn't available, but you might be able to do a scalp cut by just dropping the false edge on the head. So that's a way to land a hit without compromising your own defense and endangering yourself, which even if it's not debilitating in any way, it might help tip the scale in your favor.
The point is going to drop down, and then to complete the cut, I'm going to lift up on my wrist, coming up underneath my opponent's guard.
This also seems quite odd from a HEMA perspective. As far as I can see, this looks like this wrist action at the end basically taps the opponent with the flat of the blade instead of actually cutting with the edge. Seeing things like this makes me think that this would be the right fighting style for lightsabers, because this really relies on compacting everything, shortening the movement so much that you become extremely fast. And the kind of speed and athleticism you can see in Olympic fencing matches is astonishing. It's very impressive. So that's really, if you had an actual lightsaber, a weapon that can damage anything with just a touch, don't have to worry about force generation, you don't have to worry about edge alignment. There is no edge, or it's an omni-edge, however you want to look at it. Whichever side you touch with is going to be effective. So this is perfect for that. I mean, it's probably not going to look as epic and heroic as you would like for Star Wars and other settings, but it would make the most sense. That's all I've got for now. Just one more thing. I've seen a number of times people criticize Olympic fencing for basically considerations like this. They come from a HEMA perspective or some other form of historical art, martial art, and they don't like what they see in Olympic fencing because they say this wouldn't work and this and that and the other, which in and of itself is not an invalid point. However, don't do that. It's like a golfer showing up at a mini golf course and lecturing everybody on everything they're doing wrong. It doesn't make sense. It's a different set of rules, different goals, and that's really it. You can draw some comparisons because obviously it derives from historical saber fencing, but keep in mind that you should not be applying different rules on something that's not designed for that. Just saying. I've seen it too many times, and it's a bit odd. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you found it interesting, and have a good one, folks.